In Harlem, power rarely announced itself. It didn't crash through doors or shout from rooftops. It settled into rooms quietly, shaping the way people spoke, the way they waited, the way they chose their words. By the late 1950s, there were places in Harlem where conversations slowed the moment one man entered, not out of fear exactly, but out of understanding. Those rooms belonged to Bumpy Johnson. He didn't demand attention. He didn't need to. His presence did the work for him. Men straightened their posture. Eyes shifted just enough to acknowledge him without staring. Everyone knew where they stood in relation to him, even if no one said it out loud. That kind of authority wasn't built overnight. It was earned through years of patience, calculation, and an unshakable sense of control. And wherever Bumpy Johnson went, there was always one man who moved with him so naturally that people barely noticed him at all. His bodyguard, not a new face, not a temporary hire. This was a man who had been there for years, long enough to become part of the background. Long enough that his presence felt permanent, unquestioned. He knew Bumpy's schedule better than most of his associates. He knew which streets were taken out of habit, which entrances were avoided, which rooms felt safe, and which ones required silence. He stood close, but never too close, alert, but never obvious. His job wasn't just to protect Bumpy from danger, it was to make danger hesitate. That kind of trust doesn't come easy in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson didn't trust quickly, and he didn't forget easily. Men earned their place beside him through loyalty tested under pressure, through moments when choosing the easy option would have meant walking away. This bodyguard had passed those tests. He had stood beside Bumpy in tense meetings. He had watched arguments turn sharp and then calm again. He had seen power shift hands without a single shot fired. And through it all, he stayed silent. That silence was his strength. In a world where everyone talked too much, the man who said nothing learned everything. He heard names mentioned casually that weren't meant to travel. He noticed who arrived early and who lingered after meetings ended. He stood behind Bumpy during conversations that shaped Harlem's future, absorbing details that no one thought to guard against him, because no one suspected him. That's the danger of proximity. The closer someone stands to power, the less people question why they're there. Familiarity becomes permission. Routine becomes trust. And trust, once established, creates blindness. Most people imagine betrayal as something dramatic, a sudden turn, a violent moment, a clear line crossed. But real betrayal doesn't look like that. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, hidden behind routine and justification. It grows in the space where loyalty is assumed instead of examined. For years, nothing felt wrong. The bodyguard moved the same way he always had. He watched the same exits. He scanned the same faces. When tension filled a room, he stayed still. When voices rose, he remained calm. He did his job so well that he disappeared into it, and that invisibility made him more powerful than anyone realized. In Harlem, everyone watched everyone else. But the man no one watched had the clearest view of all. He saw the city changing. Money moves faster now. New players tested old boundaries. The Italian mob watched Harlem with growing frustration, blocked at every turn by a man they couldn't intimidate, couldn't rush, and couldn't buy, not directly at least. They understood something fundamental about power. If you can't reach the man at the top, you look for the man standing closest to him. Not to fight him, to turn him. The bodyguard didn't see himself as disloyal. That's important to understand. In his own mind, he was still doing his job, still protecting Bumpy from immediate threats. He didn't think about the dangers that didn't announce themselves, the kind that arrived wrapped in polite conversations, reasonable offers, and quiet inevitability. Because betrayal doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with justification. He told himself nothing had happened yet, that listening wasn't agreeing, that considering an option wasn't choosing it. These thoughts are powerful because they allow a man to cross lines without realizing he's crossed them at all. Every day he stood behind Bumpy. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier on his shoulder. He carried secrets that weren't his to carry, And over time, those secrets began to feel heavier than the loyalty that had bound him there. And still, no one noticed. Not the men at the tables, not the musicians playing softly in the background, not the rivals watching from a distance, not even Bumpy Johnson himself. Because trust, once earned, makes people comfortable, and comfort dulls instinct. This is the part most people don't want to accept. The most dangerous betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from familiarity, from routine, from the man who knows exactly how close he needs to stand to change everything. Before we go any further, pause for a second. If this tension already feels real to you, if you can feel how fragile trust becomes when power is involved, tap the like button. It helps this story reach people who appreciate depth, not just headlines. What made this situation even more dangerous was that nothing had gone wrong yet. There were no mistakes, no visible cracks. The bodyguard still played his role flawlessly, and that's exactly what made him valuable to people watching from the outside. Because a man who looks loyal is far more dangerous than a man who admits he isn't. By the time betrayal becomes visible, it has already done its most important work. The damage isn't done in the moment of action. It's done in the days and weeks before, when trust quietly changes shape. Somewhere in that quiet stretch of time, a line was crossed. Not publicly, not dramatically, but permanently. By the end of this chapter, one thing should be clear. The bodyguard didn't wake up one morning and decide to turn on Bumpy Johnson. The threat wasn't sudden. It was close. It was time. It was the long silence no one fought to question. Because when the man standing closest becomes the danger, the room doesn't explode. It goes silent. Pressure never arrived at the bodyguard's door with urgency. It didn't demand attention or threaten consequences. That was intentional. The men who wanted Bumpy Johnson removed understood something most people don't. Real pressure works best when it feels reasonable, when it feels like a choice. The first sign was almost invisible. An ordinary afternoon, an ordinary street. The bodyguard noticed a familiar face lingering across the road, not watching him directly, not doing anything that could be called suspicious. Just a present. Harlem was full of faces, but this one didn't belong to the neighborhood. It didn't spark fear. It sparked curiosity, and curiosity is where control begins to slip. A few days later, the message came the same way, quietly. No phone call, no note. Just an invitation passed through someone he recognized but didn't trust enough to question. A name, a time, a place, nothing more. No pressure to attend, no consequences for ignoring it. That absence of force mattered. When the bodyguard arrived, the meeting didn't feel dangerous. It felt measured. The man waiting for him wore a clean suit and spoke with calm precision. There were no raised voices, no aggressive posturing. He spoke like someone who believed the outcome was already decided, not because he assumed agreement, but because he understood patience. He didn't start with money. He started with understanding. He spoke about pressure, about responsibility, about what it meant to stand between power and chaos every day. He acknowledged the weight of the job, the constant vigilance, the toll of living on alert. These weren't tactics. They were truths, and that's what made them effective. Only after that did the offer appear, not pushed across the table, not demanded, simply revealed. The bodyguard didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. The number settled into his mind immediately. Enough to leave, enough to breathe, enough to imagine a life where every sound didn't feel like a warning. And still, he didn't say yes. Not yet. That hesitation wasn't loyalty asserting itself. It was fear asking questions. Fear of consequences, fear of being seen, fear of becoming something he couldn't undo. The man across from him didn't interrupt the silence. He let it stretch. Silence creates ownership. If the bodyguard spoke first, the choice would feel like his. "You wouldn't be betraying him," the man finally said. "You'd just be stepping aside." That sentence mattered more than the money. Stepping aside didn't sound violent. It didn't feel cruel. It felt passive, clean, almost honorable. The bodyguard told himself he wasn't being asked to pull a trigger. He wasn't being asked to plan anything. He was just being asked to let something happen. That's how betrayal becomes acceptable. The man didn't ask for an answer that night. He stood, straightened his jacket, and left the offer behind, not on the table, but in the air. It followed the bodyguard home. It followed him into sleep. It settled into the quiet moments when the city finally stopped moving. Days passed. Nothing changed. That was the most dangerous part. Bumpy Johnson didn't treat him differently. Meetings continued. Routines held. Trust remained intact. And with every normal interaction, the bodyguard felt a strange mixture of relief and pressure. Relief that nothing had gone wrong. Pressure because the choice hadn't gone away. He began to notice things differently, not with malice, but with calculation. Where he stood, how close he stood when Bumpy turned his back. These were things he had always known, but now they carried weight. Meaning, the second meeting came quickly, shorter, more direct. This time, the money was mentioned first, not waived, not counted, simply acknowledged. And this time, refusal carried consequences not through threats, but through certainty. The mob didn't promise protection, they promised inevitability. Things would change whether he participated or not. Loyalty didn't mean safety. It only meant choosing a side without leverage. That was the moment the bodyguard realized the truth. The deal wasn't really an offer anymore. It was an exit, and exits are hard to ignore when you feel trapped. He didn't agree out loud. He didn't need to. His silence did the work. Silence had carried him this far, it carried him over the line as well. By the third conversation, the details were settled. Time, place, position, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just alignment. The kind of planning that happens when people believe the outcome is already secured. The bodyguard told himself one last story, that this wasn't personal, that it wasn't about Bumpy Johnson, that this was about survival, about choosing a future before one was chosen for him. That justification mattered, because once he believed it, the line disappeared. Before we move on, let me ask you something and answer honestly. If pressure comes quietly, if the offer feels reasonable, if no one gets hurt immediately, where does loyalty end? Leave your answer in the comments. This story becomes heavier when you sit with that question. By the time the final meeting ended, the bodyguard was already living in two versions of reality. In one, he was still the trusted man standing closest to power. In the other, he was already gone, replaced by someone who had made a choice he couldn't unmake. And still, no one noticed. Not the mob's rivals, not the men in the room, not the man whose life was about to change. Because betrayal doesn't announce itself when it begins. It waits. As the night of the meeting drew closer, the bodyguard believed the hardest part was over. He believed the danger was behind him. He believed that when the moment came, it would be quick, controlled, and final. What he did know, what he couldn't see, was that while he was convincing himself the deal was sealed, Bumpy Johnson had already started playing a different game, one that didn't involve speed, or force, or forgiveness. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive Harlem by reacting faster than other men. He survived by reacting later after everyone else had already made their move. Speed impressed people. Patience defeated them. The first sign didn't arrive as a warning. There was no whispered name, no urgent message, no sudden shift in behavior that could be pointed to and explained. It arrived as something far more subtle, a pattern that no longer felt right, a pause that lingered too long, a routine that felt slightly rehearsed. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To Bumpy, it meant everything. He had learned long ago that danger rarely announces itself. It blends in, it waits, and it often wears a familiar face. Bumpy didn't accuse anyone. He didn't ask questions. He didn't alter his behavior in ways that could be noticed. That would have been a mistake. When suspicion surfaces too early, it gives betrayal time to adjust. And Bumpy understood that the most dangerous moment in any power struggle is the moment your opponent realizes they've been seen. So he stayed exactly the same. He spoke when he always spoke. He listened when he always listened. He leaned back in his chair with the same relaxed confidence. He let the room believe nothing had changed, because for everyone else, nothing had. That was always his advantage. People mistook his calm for comfort, his silence for ignorance. Information reached Bumpy the same way it always had, not through force, not through fear, but through attention. A bartender mentioned a name that didn't belong in the conversation. A driver noticed a familiar figure standing where he shouldn't have been. A man spoke too carefully, choosing words as if he were practicing them in advance. Small details. Separate moments. Together, they formed a picture, and at the center of that picture stood the one man Bumpy had trusted without question. That's what made the situation dangerous, not because betrayal was new to him, but because proximity changed the stakes. Anyone could be an enemy. Few could be trusted with access. Fewer still could be trusted with silence. Bumpy sat with that knowledge longer than anyone expected him to. He waited carefully, not because he doubted what he was seeing, but because he understood what it meant. Ending the threat quietly would have been easy. One phone call. One order. The problem disappears, and the city moves on. But Bumpy wasn't interested in solutions that only worked once. He knew how this world functioned. If one attempt failed quietly, another would follow, another approach, another offer. Another man standing too close. Cutting off the symptom didn't cure the disease. What Harlem needed wasn't another body. It needed a lesson. So instead of stopping the betrayal, Bumpy allowed it to continue. He gave it room to breathe. He let it gain confidence. He let the bodyguard believe the deal was intact, that the plan was working, that nothing had changed. Every day that passed without confrontation tightened the trap. Bumpy understood something the men watching from the outside didn't. Betrayal collapses under its own weight if you don't interrupt it too soon. He didn't need proof. He needed timing. The setting mattered. This couldn't happen in the dark. It couldn't disappear into rumor or speculation. It had to unfold where witnesses couldn't look away, where silence would speak louder than violence, where everyone present would understand the message without a single explanation. That's when Bumpy made the only adjustment he needed to make. He didn't remove the bodyguard. He didn't test him. He didn't threaten him. He changed the outcome. The gun, the symbol of the entire plan, became the key. Not by firing it, by neutralizing it. Quietly, carefully, without disturbing the illusion of control the bodyguard believed he still had. No one noticed the change. That was the point. The bodyguard still stood where he always stood. He moved the same way. He watched the same exits. He believed the final moment would belong to him. Every step he took closer to that night made the revelation inevitable. And Bumpy waited. If you're still here, stay with me. Because what happens next only works because Bumpy refused to rush. This is where power stops being loud and starts being permanent. By the time the night arrived, everything was already in place. The room had been chosen carefully. The crowd was exactly the right mix: men who mattered, men who talked, men who would remember. The atmosphere was heavy before anything happened, thick with the kind of tension that doesn't have a name yet. Bumpy took his seat like it was any other night, calm, unbothered, composed. Behind him, the bodyguard took his position, the same distance, the same angle, the same confidence. The deal was active, the moment was close, and Bumpy Johnson was exactly where he wanted to be. Because the most dangerous power play isn't stopping betrayal when it begins. It's letting it reveal itself. The room was full, but it didn't feel crowded. It felt contained, as if every sound knew where it was allowed to exist. Cigarette smoke hung low, catching the light just enough to soften the edges of faces that had seen too much to be surprised easily. Glasses rested half full on dark wooden tables. Conversations moved carefully, never fully stopping, never fully relaxing. It was the kind of night Harlem had seen 1,000 times, and the kind of night no one would forget. Bumpy Johnson sat where he always sat, not in the center of the room, not hidden away either, a place that allowed him to see without being seen too much. He leaned back slightly, listening to a man across from him speak, nodding at the right moments. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if nothing in the world required urgency. Behind him stood the bodyguard, the same position, the same distance, the same angle. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was the brilliance of it. No tension visible, no warning signs, no sudden movements, just routine, unfolding exactly as it always had. But inside the bodyguard's chest, everything felt louder. His breathing was controlled but shallow. His heartbeat didn't race, it pulsed, heavy and deliberate, like it was counting something down. Weeks of justification had led to this moment. Weeks of telling himself that this wasn't personal, that this was inevitable, that survival sometimes demanded silence. He waited, not for a signal, not for permission, for an opening. When Bumpy leaned forward just slightly, shifting his attention toward the table, the bodyguard felt it. Not because anything had happened, but because everything was about to. His hand moved inside his jacket, smooth and practiced the way it had been trained to move. No one reacted. No one looked up. This was the man who stood closest. His movements were invisible by design. That was the final confirmation. He drew the gun. Time didn't slow down. It stopped. The weight of the pistol felt different now. He noticed it in a way he never had before. The metal is colder. He raised it, steadying his hand inches from the back of Bumpy Johnson's head. For a brief moment, the room existed without sound. Even the music seemed to hesitate. Then his finger tightened. Click. The sound was small, almost disappointing. But it was enough. The band stopped mid-note. Conversations collapsed into silence so complete it felt unnatural. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor, the sharp crack echoing louder than it should have. Every head in the room turned at once. The bodyguard blinked. His finger tightened again. Click. Nothing. In that instant, understanding arrived without explanation. Not gradually. Not intellectually. Instantly. This wasn't a failure. This was exposure. His grip loosened. The gun felt heavier now, useless, unfamiliar. Confidence drained from his body all at once, replaced by a cold realization that spread faster than panic ever could. He hadn't lost control of the moment. He had never owned it. And then Bumpy Johnson moved. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't stand. He didn't turn sharply. He set his glass down first, carefully, as if the moment deserved respect. Then he turned his head just enough to look over his shoulder. Their eyes met. There was no shock in Bumpy's expression, no confusion, no fear, only disappointment. "I trusted you," Bumpy said quietly. 5 words. They carried more weight than any gunshot ever could. The bodyguard's knees buckled. The pistol slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor, the sound sharp against the silence. No one rushed forward. No one tried to intervene. The room didn't move. Bumpy stood up then, not abruptly, not angrily. He stood like a man who had already finished the conversation before it began. "You thought this was about killing me," he said calmly, his voice steady enough to reach every corner of the room. "It never was." The bodyguard tried to speak, but words abandoned him. Everything he had hidden behind silence now stood exposed in front of men who understood exactly what it meant. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult him. He didn't threaten him. He didn't need to. "This," Bumpy continued, gesturing lightly toward the fallen gun, "is what happens when you mistake access for power." Every man in that room understood the message immediately. Violence would have been easier. Blood would have been simpler. But this was permanent. If this moment has you holding your breath, stay with me. This is the turning point. What happens next is why this story survived long after the night ended. Bumpy's eyes moved slowly around the room, meeting faces without challenging them. He wasn't asking for permission. He was reminding them who was in control. Then he looked back down at the man who had stood behind him for years. "You're leaving tonight," Bumpy said. "You'll take what you can carry, and you won't come back." The bodyguard nodded, tears cutting through the shock on his face. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He recognized mercy when he saw it, and he understood it wouldn't come twice. "And when they ask you what happened here," Bumpy added, his voice dropping just enough to feel heavier, "you'll tell them the truth." The truth didn't need explanation. It had already filled the room. The bodyguard stood on shaking legs, backed away slowly, and walked toward the door. No one followed him. No one stopped him. He disappeared into the night without a word spoken after him. Only when the door closed did the room begin to breathe again, because from that moment on, everyone who had witnessed the silence understood something they would never say out loud. Bumpy Johnson didn't need violence to win. He needed patience. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one laughed it off or pretended it hadn't happened. Even when the music slowly started again, it sounded restrained, like it knew better than to rise too quickly. Conversations resumed in fragments, careful and low, as if the walls themselves were listening. Bumpy Johnson sat back down. That single act carried more authority than any speech ever could. He didn't chase the man who had betrayed him. He didn't explain himself. He didn't justify what he had done. In Harlem, explanations were for men who needed permission. Bumpy didn't. Power, when it's real, doesn't demand understanding. It creates it. Within minutes, the night moved forward. Drinks were poured again. Chairs shifted. The city resumed its rhythm. To anyone who walked in late, it would have looked like nothing had happened. But for the men who were there, everything had changed. The bodyguard never returned. Some said he left Harlem before sunrise, carrying only what he could hold. Others claimed he vanished into another city, another name, another life that never quite fit. No one knew the truth, and no one went looking. In that world, disappearing wasn't unusual. What was unusual was why he was allowed to. Bumpy Johnson had spared him. At first, that decision confused people. In a world where betrayal was often answered with violence, mercy felt like a mistake, weakness even. But as the story spread quietly, carefully, that confusion turned into something else: understanding. Death ends a problem once. Exposure ends it forever. By the next morning, the story had traveled far beyond that room, not as gossip, not as an exaggeration, as a warning. The details were repeated with precision. The silence, the click, the calm way Bumpy turned around. Men didn't embellish it. They didn't need to. The truth carried enough weight on its own. Every crew member heard it. Every boss heard it. Every man standing close to power heard it. And they all understood the same lesson. If you're still watching right now, this is why this story matters. Subscribe to the channel, because these aren't just stories about crime. They're stories about how power really works. The Italian mob reacted quickly, but not with retaliation. Meetings were called. Plans were reconsidered. For the first time in a long while, the conclusion around the table was unanimous. Bumpy Johnson wasn't reckless. He wasn't lucky. And he wasn't vulnerable. He was patient. They had tried force. They had tried numbers. They had tried money. And every time, he had seen it coming. After that night, the idea of turning Bumpy's inner circle quietly disappeared, not because it was impossible, but because the cost was too high. A failed hit was one thing. Public exposure was another. No organization survives repeated humiliation. Harlem absorbed the lesson in its own way. People spoke about loyalty differently after that. Not as something guaranteed, not as something assumed. Loyalty became a responsibility. Standing close to power wasn't just a privilege anymore, it was a test. One that never stopped. Bumpy Johnson continued his life exactly as he had before. Same routines, same posture, same quiet authority. But something around him had shifted. Not fear, respect, the deeper kind. The kind that doesn't fade when the room empties. Years later, when people talked about Bumpy Johnson, they didn't start with violence. They talked about control, about how he never rushed, about how he let others reveal themselves, about how the most dangerous thing he ever did was wait. And the story of the bodyguard became more than a moment. It became a reminder that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies, that silence can be louder than gunfire, and that real power isn't about pulling the trigger. It's about knowing when you never need to. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what stood out most: the trust, the betrayal, or the silence. And if you want more stories where power and loyalty collide, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story proves something even more unsettling. Sometimes the man standing closest isn't just watching power. He's learning exactly how to use it.